Hello, everyone. My name is Alina Bonadonna, and I'm, as always, super happy and excited to welcome you to our NEMIS Academy webinar. And today's session is super special, first of all, because it's a Christmas edition. Second, it's my pleasure to introduce Darin Detwiler, a leading voice in food safety and with decades of experience addressing systemic issues in food supply chain. Hi, Darin, how are you?
Great yourself.
Perfect. I'm so happy to see you here. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here, and we talked in Amsterdam a while back, and it was kind of just a great opportunity to follow through with being able to pull together this webinar.
Definitely. And today's our session is a bit different from the previous ones because we will have an interview format where you are able to ask questions throughout our time, and we will discuss the key recalls which happened throughout this year. And believe me, guys, it will be really hot webinar. Darin, can you introduce yourself for those who maybe hear you and see you first time, which I dubbed for actually.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to admit, I see so many familiar names on the list of attendees, but I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler. I'm a professor at Northeastern University in Boston, where I specialize in regulatory affairs, food law, global economics, food and agriculture, global corporate social responsibility, and that type of a focus. I am an author of various books: Food Safety Past, Present, and Predictions, Building the Future of Food Safety Technology. I've contributed to books on food law. I was a participant in the recent Emmy Award winning Netflix documentary Poisoned, The Dirty Truth About Your Food. But ultimately, I've been involved in food safety for over 3 decades in various capacities as unofficial and then as an appointed advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture for the United States Department of Agriculture. I've collaborated with the Food and Drug Administration. I've served as a chairperson with the National Environmental Health Association. I've worked for nonprofit organizations. I've been part of various International Association for Food Protection committees, and I've received some awards from them. So over the years, I've had many opportunities to work in various capacities. I also travel around the world speaking before various audiences, like in Amsterdam with New Food, and Dubai and Ireland and London, so many different places. And I host and guest on many podcasts, and I have columns in magazines, and I have to admit, I don't leave too many rocks unturned in terms of places for me to participate and ways for me to participate in our growing evolution of food safety over the past 3 decades.
Great, great. And guys, you cannot even imagine how honored I am to host Darin today because the topic is super important and we have amazing opportunity now to ask for about the most trickiest question from the experts online. So Darin, let's maybe do a quick overview of 2024. So what were the main recalls, what happened, and with what pathogens it was related mainly?
Well, here's what's crazy. Alina, when you and I started planning on, doing this webinar here, most of the reports were showing that the biggest trend was salmonella
Yeah,
for not only the US but even the UK and the EU. And
yeah,
then things just kind of took a little bit of a turn, and now the evidence is showing that listeria is the big the big co-star, if you will, in terms of the world of food safety recalls this year. I mean, seriously, you go back, and I can't possibly list everything, but when it comes to just listeria alone, I'm going to read it off of a list here. We had basically every kind of cheese: soft cheese, yogurt, sour cream, cream cheese, queso, multiple recalls. Salmon, multiple recalls. Chicken street taco or meal kits, multiple recalls. Nuts in various forms, multiple recalls. Spinach and salad kits. Frozen waffles and pancakes, ready to eat meals, and store made deli items. Sandwiches, various sprouts, guacamoles, jalapenos, you name the vegetable. Cucumbers,
Yeah.
carrots, onions have been involved. Ice cream products, confectionaries like candies and cereals and candy bars, mushrooms, arugula, chia seeds, so many different things. And then you start looking at, we had the cucumbers with the salmonella, very recent, eggs, green onions, cantaloupe again.
Great.
And with E. coli, we had not only the onions, but carrots there as well. And so it's been a mixture here in the US of things we've seen already multiple times and also some things we don't typically see, a lot of which is ready to eat food or foods we just don't cook anymore.
Yeah.
In terms of meat, on the meat side in the United States, multiple recalls of ready to eat meats, almost 45,000 pounds of ready to eat meat and meat poultry products from one incident. There was the 11.765 million pounds of ready to eat meat and poultry from Bruce Pack. We have Boar's Head. I think we're going to touch on this a little bit more. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Boar's Head had 7.2 million pounds of a variety of different ready to eat meats. And that one, we had over 60 illnesses and hospitalizations and 10 deaths across 19 states. If we start to look abroad, we do see a lot with listeria, but there's a pattern I think you'll notice. We had various meat products, salmon, chicken, butter, sausages, salami, bacon, some ready to eat salads, raw milk, a lot of raw milk cheese and raw milk, bacons, cheeses, some chocolate spread, kebabs, shrimps, duck mousse, chicken schnitzel, mussels, clams, minced steaks, of so many varieties of meats being recalled and ready to eat foods. But we see uh, more in the UK and EU, more of those. Yes, there were some salads, ready to eat salads, and some items, but more of them were meat related than they were. Um, we saw a good number of produce and much more ready to eat food with the US recalls. So even though there's a significant numbers there, again, mostly we're seeing a lot of it being listeria. And I think the big difference between the US and the EU and UK recalls, the US had a lot more produce and ready to eat foods.
Yeah, 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 definitely. The number is crazy. And just a quick note to all attendees, like you guys can drop a message right now with the trickiest question. Don't miss the opportunity because we have only 1 hour. And within this 1 hour, Darin can't wait to hear the trickiest questions. I know it. Yeah, so Darin, let's maybe unpack some special case, let's say country specific. Uh, what do you see as the recurring root causes behind this year's recalls in US specifically?
Well, I actually don't think these are just US specific. I think these are kind of listeria specific, if you will.
Yeah,
Um, in terms of the rise of listeria, I would say I would identify six items. I don't know why I just held up not six fingers, but six items. I think that the one we can definitely look at is the idea that our supply chains are becoming more complex, right? We see increased globalization of food production. These lead to not only more opportunities for contamination at multiple points in the supply chain, but they also result in more blind spots, areas where we either used to not pay attention or not pay attention as much as we need to now. More blind spots, right? We have distribution centers, a more complex distribution, and when we're talking about listeria, we have to remember that throughout this complex supply chain, Listeria thrives in cold environments, which are common in food transport and storage
Mhm.
for these fresh and frozen foods. So we need to make sure that we're truly aware of our environmental monitoring in all these different situations. The second thing I would point out is sanitation. I mentioned the boar's head earlier. There were 69 inspections that were revealing critical failures over the course of a year that are definitely seen as part of the cause behind this major listeria outbreak.
Yeah.
Listeria can form biofilms, which are basically sticky layers of bacteria on equipment and surfaces. We're seeing this in spray nozzles and spray needles and uh, drainage surfaces, walls, storage racks, so many different places where these biofilms are making it hard to eliminate through standard or traditional cleaning practices. So essentially, poor cleaning protocols or inconsistent adherence to sanitation procedures are allowing bacteria to persist. Number
Yeah.
three, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted like actually clarify, not clarify, but I'm just curious. A lot of people they are talking about Boar's Head because it's a huge corporation, right? But what about like smaller companies? Are they handle food safety on a similar way? Is it still the same issue for them, or you would separate it completely from big company?
I'm really glad you asked that because, Listeria, the pathogen, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're a large company or a small company. Adequate sanitation would be the same whether it's a small company or a large company. I think that one of the things we saw with some of these outbreaks, especially when you have multiple states or multiple countries impacted, is that the more locations geographically that are impacted, we tend to go back to the root causes, go back to the source. And so even, these small companies, whether it's a small retailer or a small restaurant, they're probably getting these products from a middleman, from a distributor, and
Yeah.
looking at the idea of continuing on that. But I think that rather regardless of if it's a small or large company, one thing we have to look at is the fact that there has been a growth in ready to eat foods, an increased demand, everything from salads to deli meats, prepackaged meals, right? These are
Mm-hmm.
often consumed without cooking, which would normally kill listeria and other pathogens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so contamination during processing is a critical risk. We looked at some of these other produce. I mean, outside of listeria, right? We had the onions, we had the cucumbers, you had the a lot of leafy greens and salad kits. You don't cook cucumbers, right? You don't cook the salads. You don't cook so many of these ready to eat foods. So there's an assumption that, well, the end consumer is not going to do a kill step. So we need to make sure that in terms of sanitation, that the best possible kill steps are taken as early as possible and throughout the process, all the way to that last step there. Um, there's a couple of other factors that are kind of generic. Are there aging and facilities and equipment that may be lacking modern designs to prevent contamination? Um, is there a lapse in terms of adopting various equipment, predictive analytics, testing equipment, advancements in testing that could lead to more frequent detection of listeria. And this is one of those things kind of underscores the persistence of contamination within the food supply if we're not detecting it in the first place. And then I can't leave out, I know this may be controversial, but I can't leave out the fact that there's conversations out there about climate change literally impacting temperature and humidity levels that are driving and favoring listeria's growth and spread in certain regions and even certain facilities. So you take those six areas, right? The complexity of our supply chain, inadequate sanitation, the growth of ready to eat foods, aging facilities and equipment, testing and detection, and perhaps even climate change. And all those together are creating scenarios where we probably are seeing some of these rises in listeria activity.
Yeah, definitely. Everything is like one circle of everything together. And actually, we have a question came from Rebecca Kaya, kind of touching what we already discussed a bit. Does the limited number of suppliers of some ingredients, perhaps due to failed harvest or climate change, war, etc., affect the risk of outbreaks? And what can be done by retailers to mitigate these risks?
Oh, this is perfect because if you look at some of the instances where we have major outbreaks, especially ones that are involving multi-state, multinational restaurants. So, for instance, the a number of years back, there was a number of outbreaks that are thought to have been tied to the produce at a Mexican food restaurant, a big chain. And they came out and said that they needed to reevaluate the idea of limited suppliers that are supplying across a large geographical distance, and that they wanted to look at more regional suppliers after the recent outbreak with E. coli at their onions and the quarter pounders at McDonald's. There's
Yeah.
some conversation about the idea of, well, if they'd had, they had one single supplier of all those onions across all those states. I believe it was 14 states, maybe 15.
Yeah, yeah,
And again, the conversation around if we had had fewer, more regional suppliers, perhaps it would have, slowed down this outbreak. So whether it's retail or restaurant, some of these after incident conversations and held by leadership are looking at the idea of yes, it may have a upfront economic advantage to have less suppliers, but in the long run, when you look at the idea of minimizing outbreaks and dealing with these, perhaps an advantage to have more suppliers kind of a situation. And I think too, we
mm,
have to realize that in most cases, especially with the restaurants, they want consistency. They want the consistent lettuce, the consistent onions, whatever it is, the consistent ingredients year round. They want the same taste, the same quality. And so to do that, you tend to minimize the number of suppliers.
yeah.
But again, that comes with consequences.
Yeah, and what's, for example, in your opinion, can be applied to suppliers to control the quality of their products, the same as for farmers, for example?
Sure.
Because what we mentioned a bit more about factory control, but what about supplier control?
Well, I think that it's important to note that you can't outsource responsibility. You can't say you're responsible, but I'm not. When we're all part of this, whether you're at the farm, the distributor, and even the retailer restaurant, and any point in between, everyone has a role to play. So that restaurant at the end can't say, well, it's their fault, especially if it's like perhaps, and I've seen that. I've been in courtrooms where this exact question came up. um, that restaurant that, you know uh, an outbreak is associated with that restaurant, but they say, well, it's from our supplier. Was that restaurant doing their own independent testing or third party testing, or just taking the word of their supplier? So there has to be a commitment to have that kind of involvement all the way along, right? And yeah, it sounds maybe like, well, that must be expensive for a restaurant, a big internet, a big multinational restaurant chain, to have someone who goes out there and makes sure that the restaurant and the distributor and the warehouse is sanitary, right, or has done their testing and has proven that the produce is safe. But don't look at the cost of doing that. Look at the cost of not doing that, right? If you're not doing that, think how much money these companies are going to be losing. Think how many
Yeah,
lives are impacted and will never and they'll never have the opportunity to rebound like these companies will, because someone was not making sure that that responsibility was carried all the way through.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, we are coming closer to answering next question, which came is about leadership, to spoil it a bit. So the question is, um, my question is about management commitment. What steps can be taken to foster a culture of accountability at the leadership level to avoid such incidents?
Well, on one hand, I've noted over the years that there are corporate leaders who, even after, during, or after a major outbreak, it's like they still get their big, multi-million dollar Christmas bonus kind of a thing, or they get this huge salary. And what you end up finding is that the metrics that were used to determine their performance often had nothing to do with food safety, right? It was about increasing sales, or improving the marketplace position or whatever, right? So we need to look at food company executives in terms of being actually held responsible by their share owners, right? Their stockholders, and the overall leadership in terms of food safety. But I think that ultimately, we need to cultivate and validate and quite honestly celebrate good leadership. And there's a difference between certain kinds of leadership. I think that in reality, we need to have a culture of accountability, right? Cultivating a sense of ownership and courage in every role, not just the highest leadership roles, but in all leadership roles, right? We need
Yeah,
to move beyond reactive leadership. I mean, yes, there's reactive leadership, there's crisis management, but we need to have proactive and intentionality. We need intentional leaders who are proactive. They're looking for evidence and signs before there is public harm, right? Most times, all these recalls we talked about, recalls are typically called after someone gets harmed, after someone's sick, after they're hospitalized, after someone dies. And every single time you start looking at the root cause analysis, and you start
yeah,
finding that there were actually signs earlier, whether it was inspections, whether it was other things. And so, why aren't we acting on those early signs and being proactive and intentional and saying, hey, let's stop this here before we ship the product, right? So, we need to
yeah,
have much more rapid testing, especially with ready to eat foods. I think that there are many foods that need to be held a little bit longer until test results come back, or before it's shipped out to the stores, the retailers, the restaurants, to allow for testing to truly make sure it's safe. I also think that in terms of intentional leadership, right? We need to look at the idea of what can we do to predict and to mitigate these problems before they occur as much as possible. We can't predict everything. But if we don't
yeah,
have leadership that is of a mindset and is given the tools and the resources to try to be predictive, to try to be proactive, then these things will never happen. A lot of this is based on past, understanding past experiences, not just within your own company, but even, other companies that are selling similar products. Lessons learned, and build upon those lessons, and do this. Now, I say this all like it's an ideal, some kind of ideal situation, but here's the reality. After all these incidents, recalls, and outbreaks, there's always leaders who say, this happened. We had this big outbreak. We had this big recall. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to prioritize food safety. We're going to put someone in charge of this. We're going to give them the resources to do this. We're going to hire an advisory team, right? We're going to
yeah,
invest in new protocols. We're going to invest in new equipment, new testing, new auditing. We're going to go back and we're going to reevaluate our protocols, and we're going to retrain our people. I'm always asking, why weren't they doing this all along? Look at Boar's Head, for instance. Boar's Head has been around for 120 years. They existed before Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906. They had plenty of time to reevaluate these things and to reestablish these priorities and investments and reevaluate their protocols. They're going to say this now. based on what's happened here in 2024, we're going to prioritize, invest, and retrain. Why weren't you doing it all along? So that is what intentional and proactive leadership looks like. You don't wait until the news hits the press, the television and the newspapers of all these failures to say, now's the time we're going to be a leader. And we have to look beyond the cost of doing nothing. It costs money to be compliant. It does. I get it. But it costs a lot more when you're out of compliance. Recalls are expensive. Outbreaks are expensive.
Yeah.
Outbreaks impact public health and people's lives. In many cases, people's lives are never going to be the same as they were before they got sick. So the costs of noncompliance are huge as compared to the cost of compliance. And that is what an intentional and proactive leader should be doing.
Yeah, it sounds like a perfect world, honestly. So I hope it will become reality and something that we don't need to repeat 100 times or until something really bad happens.
Well,
I'm so
I
pleased.
need to state though, hold on, I need to interject. These
Yeah.
actually do exist. I know great people in great companies who are intentional and proactive leaders. I know if I didn't know so many people that were great leaders and who did prioritize and invest in food safety, I don't know if I would be comfortable doing what I do today, right? I think that we need to learn more from these great leaders.
Yeah.
I think that we need to listen to them. I think we need to not just listen to our past experiences with our own companies, but listen to those proactive leaders who are saying, I'm not just going to tell people in my company, I'm not just going to tell people in my industry or my sector, my commodity. I'm going to tell the entire industry how I was able to deal with this problem, how I was able to be that effective leader, how I was able to improve this or increase this, and really start listening. And I think that we were just talking before we started here about webinars and conferences.
Yeah.
You know, there are some people that go to conferences because they can get out of the office. But I think that those people who go and participate in webinars or live events, if they just listen to these leaders and man, those takeaways and how they can help them also be one of those great intentional proactive leaders, that is where we go from ideal to the real and see that there is real good leadership out there already.
Yeah, I love to hear it. Honestly, I'm super for it. And actually, I'm also loving to see a lot of questions already in our queue. So,
Great.
uh, yeah, I'm just scared that we won't match our 1 hour time, but we will do our best. So, question is coming about uh, basically, does the high turnover of employees in restaurants affect food safety? How do you keep them trained? And in general, like, what's your thoughts about it?
I have two answers. One is that, when you look at so many of these recalls are about issues that took place before it got to the restaurant. Employees of the restaurant can't necessarily, uh, you know, deal, be seen as taking steps that can control all of these situations, especially with, your salad items, your fresh produce, things of that nature. But one of the best examples that I have seen in there dealing with turnover is not only good training, right? Um, and holding everyone accountable, not allowing things to slide. I've been in places where, people have, they're wearing one glove, but they're handling food with both hands, or it's ripped glove, or they're going from mopping the floor to handling food, and then you question a supervisor and like, well, it's really busy. Well, that doesn't mean it's okay to not follow good safety procedures. But the
Yeah.
best example I've seen is where there was like a company or an employee led food safety meeting where now you had not just the leader who is really kind of keeping people in check in terms of food safety, but you had the employee, the workforce, if you will, really having a meeting and having more established or existing employees being able to mentor and help newer employees, and spread the word and uphold the expectations, not just that one person in charge who may or may not be actually at the location at that point. So when you really make it a team effort and that everyone has a responsibility, whether it's the newest person or the most senior person, as opposed to just the senior person, that makes a big difference.
Yeah, definitely true. Would you consider it as a like source coming from trainings, ongoing trainings for leadership, for leaders separately and for team, like a kind of team collaboration efforts, or it comes only from leader?
It needs to come from both, because there's many times where I see problems and I talk with the person in charge at a location, and I can't tell you how many times I hear this. Well, we don't have enough support from our regional district or from our regional manager or from headquarters. Well, headquarters cannot be the only source of training, inspiration, supervision, validation, oversight. There has to be a blend of both. Because if you're saying, well, we're too far away from the headquarters for anyone to really pay attention to this, no customer wants to hear that, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be a bit of both. Uh, I know some companies that say, look, we provide support for the local facilities, the local locations, but it really is something where everyone across the board has the same level of responsibility in terms of food safety.
Yeah, that's awesome. Next question is coming from Thea. Why third-party audits are unable to find the issue that companies recently faced recalls? Is it the certification body or both? Or how can we stop this blaming game?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there are companies out there. Some might remember the Peanut Corporation of America, which, they basically falsified their documents, either by going to multiple companies to get uh, the samples tested and analyzed, and went with the best results. Or if they didn't have good results, they literally just changed the date of good inspections to be more up to date. And some people went to prison for this. But one thing that was kind of noted was that many of the companies that were buying that product, the peanut dust, if you will, the peanut powder that went into their like cake mixes and other ingredients, they were not doing their own independent or third party testing. They were just taking the word from the company. So a big lesson out of this was a good, the court case was a good decade ago or so. A good outcome for this was the idea that, again, companies that are taking these ingredients need to have that ability to either have their own persons or a third party entity that goes in and not only does, whether it's inspections or the testing and sampling, but even the idea of, there's been much more significant growth in transparency, and part of the need for transparency. Not only the need in terms of like digitizing our documentation, but companies being able to easily provide their validation, their verifications, their certifications. Because if a company, a manufacturer, right, a food company or a retailer is going to say that this is certified as this, you just can't take the word from your supplier. You need to be able to have that documentation so that you have that confidence that the transparency through either your third party auditing, your certification, validation, checking, or whatever is up to your standards, whether you're the retailer or a food maker, right? And today, with so many ready to eat multi ingredient foods, yes, that is more difficult. But how can someone say that they're allergen free, right? Unless they know for a fact that the facilities making these different ingredients were allergen free. And when we find incidents, for instance, where there's a recall due to an allergen, you find, oh, and I see this so many times. We didn't realize our supplier had changed the ingredients. We just went on the assumption that they kept the same ingredients, but they swapped out their supplier for this ingredient, or they swapped out an ingredient, and we didn't know that it wasn't fill in the allergen X, Y, and Z free. Well, that's why you need to have your own or third party validation that's continuous, not just a once a year kind of a thing, in order for you to be truly confident in that transparency.
Yeah, definitely true. And there is one kind of provocative question, like about regulation authorities. So, any thoughts on USDA's responsibility in relation to the boar's head recall?
I 100% agree. I had just typed this up here. Representative Rosa DeLario from Connecticut, she's with a group of other lawmakers that are calling for a congressional investigation into not only Boar's Head's practices, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture has said that the company, Boar's Head, is under criminal investigation, but that questioning in terms of the USDA, why did they allow 69 incidences over a period of a year where there were critical failures and just allow the company to go on? So either there was a lapse in activity or there's something specific that's unknown in terms of what responsibility and what resources are given to that agency that needs to be looked at. But we need to know too that there's other companies involved in these same kind of situations. So many other companies have been involved in major recalls this year, and I think it's important to note that whether it is a federal inspection or a state level inspection, which will differentiate depending on the foods and the different scenarios here in the United States. Um, One thing that's obvious is that no company is immune to to to, to these pathogens, Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, etc. That every
Yeah.
company, regardless of who inspects them or how many times they've been inspected, they have the responsibility of mitigating, of reducing, of eliminating, and preventing these situations. One of the things specifically that's come out of Boar's Head is that there's a lack of confidence in this company's ability to have prevented future contamination. And I think that it's going to take a bit of work on the part of Boar's Head and other companies to prove not only to regulators but to consumers that their product can be safe. And it's trust is a very big word right now with this, right? The
Yeah.
idea of you put trust in a company for so long, and then when they ruin that trust, it's not easy to get that back. And they're going to have to put some work into it.
Yeah, definitely. And on your opinion, Darren, how would you change the fact that, for example, there are a lot of food which being sold now, but FDA inspects only 1%? Is
Yeah.
there maybe a way to change it, or like, what are your thoughts about it?
You know, there's a whole thing about the idea of innocent until proven guilty and, wanting businesses to grow and wanting to assume certain things. But I think that there's potentially uh, two things at least we need to consider. One is that consumers themselves play a big role, right? We literally vote with our food money. I believe, and this may not be popular, and I hope people who are joining us today, maybe give us a thumbs up or a heart if you agree with this. Consumers do play a role in terms of food safety. And if consumers are aware of these issues, and if we vote with our food money, meaning that if we don't agree with this company, then go somewhere else, perhaps consumers need to think about things in terms of the idea that food is not guaranteed to be safe. There's no there's no way for us to assume that food from the start is safe, especially when we're talking about manufacturing food, ready to eat foods, commercially packaged goods, highly processed foods, right? The more processing, the more steps in it, the more opportunity there is for failure, right? If you grow carrots in your backyard, that's one thing. If you get, some kind of carrot salad that's ready to eat made by a company or something like that, that's different. Okay. So, one is the idea that I think consumers need to start to think that food is not inherently safe, that food, there's always an opportunity, right? So Alina, for instance, I am sure you have either said or heard, look both ways before you cross the street. Put
Definitely.
on your seatbelt before you go down the road. Those are two clear, obvious examples in our lives where we make assumptions that there's a potential for risk. But you know what? We do look both ways and we do cross the street. We do put on our seatbelts and we do drive down the road. But we take precautions. That's how we need to approach food. Food may have risks, and there are things that we can and must do to make sure it's safe. Now, let's look at the other side of the equation. I honestly think that we need to be holding food companies and food company executives more accountable and even liable for these failures. When people are killed and a company can simply pay a fine and no one is held accountable when they broke a law and it resulted in someone's death, um, we tend to think that we hold people accountable. We would hold if 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 a maintenance company for an airline failed to do their job and an airplane crashed, we would sue and sue that maintenance company, and we would send someone to prison. And yet, when these things happen within the food industry, it is rare. It is a rarity when someone does anything more than simply pay a fine. There's not too many examples in the United States of someone actually going to prison. Now, do I want to see a lot of people going to prison? No. But do I want to see a lot of people getting away with essentially killing people as if it's the cost of doing business? I don't want to see that either. And perhaps if there were more harsher penalties, I'm not talking about when an accident happens. I'm not talking about when there's no possible way someone could have known this or whatever. But when you have examples of companies that they were told there's a problem and they refuse to take action, or they broke some law in some way, shape, or form, knowing that it could kill someone and someone dies, and it's like, oh, so sad. Let's continue on with business and we'll replace that leader with someone else and we'll pay the fine. That sends the opposite message. That sends a message to industry that it's okay to have horrible sanitation failures. It's okay to ignore your environmental monitoring. It's okay to not have those third party or independent checks on things. And we don't want that message to be sent either. So the consumer, I think, can play a role. And I also think that our regulatory agencies and even our courts can play a role. And perhaps that'll make a difference.
Yeah,
If you
it was.
disagree, please let us know in the chat.
I saw the reaction, so definitely people support it 100%. Yeah, and coming back to topic of ready to eat recalls, there is one very interesting question coming. Quite a long read, but I will read through it. So, coming from a meat production background, I have noticed a significant difference in ready to eat produce industry regarding what food safety means to those industries. Since the produce company is seasonal, the focus is almost required to be solely audit compliance because there is several audits a month for the entire season. I believe it leads to less time spent on practical food safety monitoring and growth when compared to the main practical food safety monitoring practices. Do you believe this is a correlation contributing to the rise of ready-to-eat recalls?
Mm, I could definitely see that. And I could see how, there are seasonal elements involved, not just with meat, right? There are various seasonal elements that are involved. One of the problems I see is that too many times, at least in the United States, some of the people who are doing some of these seasonal audits, seasonal inspections, they're also doing a wide variety of other types of inspections and regulatory activities as well. Um, but I do think that one of the kind of misconceptions I see is that, we are doing things for the inspection. I think that companies need to be, and I don't know the background of who asked this question, but I think that we need to be doing things all the time in a continuous improvement and a continuous validation type activity. Like we're always sanitizing, we are always validating, we're always testing, we're always doing all these different steps, and that these external audits and inspections and validations are but one of the tools in our toolkit, if you will, in terms of making sure that, yep, we are doing it the right way, right? So there are companies that literally do things as if, we need to clean up because the inspector's coming, right? No, you need to clean all the time. And when the inspector comes, it should be validating what you normally do to make sure that it's effective and efficient in what you're doing. That is really what it's there for. So, if we look at these different activities as always being continuous, um, then I think that would change the mind, not only in terms of how leadership looks at it, but how the production plant, the floor, everyone, maintenance, engineering, the workforce, always looks at it in terms of it's always supposed to be this clean. If we look at some of those, you look at Boar's Head, you look at some of the others incidents, they clearly were not keeping things always clean, right? And this refers back to, I don't know how many people in the audience will remember this, but earlier this year, there's a company called Family Dollar Stores that received the US's largest federal fine for failure in food safety, over 40 some odd $1 million, because they allowed a persistent problem with the rodent activity in a central distribution warehouse. They were given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity after being notified to correct these issues, and they didn't correct the issues. And it resulted in over 400 stores across 6 states being closed. Again, listeria, I wrote this in an article recently, listeria doesn't happen overnight, right?
Yeah.
Horrible sanitation conditions do not happen overnight. A lot of these recalls that we're seeing are because of persistent conditions for which there were ample opportunities for it to be resolved and improved upon. If you had a continuous improvement plan, a continuous sanitation plan that was effective and efficient, and you weren't waiting around for the next inspection to start making things look better. Um, yes, are there other potential causes and problems associated behind these? Always. But if you look at the majority of these reasons, they can usually be tied back to the same type of problems.
Yeah. Next question actually is coming from Karen Hobbs. Hi, Darin. Great to hear you
Hi,
speak again.
Karen.
I agree with what you just said about corporate accountability. My question is in terms of root cause analysis in conjunction with ready-to-eat food, such as a source of produce. Are you aware of the changes that the federal level has implemented to minimize produce outbreaks from water runoff? I feel this is the most important, and the prevention should start from the very beginning.
Yeah, I'm really uh, often heard as being vocal about water testing and treatment with irrigation. You know, when you look at the food safety, the food, the in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration's Food Safety Modernization Act really started as a produce safety act back in like 2006, and ultimately the produce safety rule, which is part of FSMA, when it was passed in 2010, signed into law in 2011, and then it started implementation after the rules were completed in 2016. Right after that, in 2016, uh, which included the produce safety act, element rule, excuse me, with water testing and treatment, a bunch of farmers and industry folks got together with the FDA and said it's a little too expensive and it's a little too difficult for us to conduct all these testing and treatments. And so they were given a pass of a number of years. Like, you can wait 4, 5, 6 years, right? What happened
Yeah.
immediately after that? All those romaine lettuce outbreaks around the November time period, year after year after year, which all came down to the fact that much of the produce that was being grown, especially in Yuma, Arizona, and other parts of the country, were too close to cattle feed operations or CAFOs. And, you know, if there had been earlier adequate testing and treatment of the water, all those could have been prevented. Now you talk about things like the carrots and the onions, and people are always asking, how do onions get contaminated with E. coli? How do these get contaminated? How are all these fresh produce getting contaminated? Well, I don't know if it's 8 or 9 times out of a 10, but most of the time it's due to contaminated irrigation water. If we were to do more adequate testing and treatment of that water, we could prevent this in the first place. You look at the ground contamination, you look at so many other factors, but the irrigation issue is there. So it's not just about having the right policies. You have to have the technologies and the resource to execute those. But also, I think that the companies that did delay that, I think they didn't do themselves much good, because the harm to the entire industry, especially leafy greens, has been significant. Now, what is happening as a result of this? I'm seeing a radical growth in the indoor ag industry, the controlled environmental agriculture, or the greenhouse growing. I'm seeing it not only here in the United States, I'm seeing it in Canada, I'm seeing it in other places where there's a lot more investment and development going on in terms of that controlled environmental agriculture, the indoor ag. And that industry is booming because of the ability to have better controls of, again, the irrigation water and other factors that are resulting in these various produce items becoming contaminated.
Yeah, it actually reminded me of one of the biggest recent recalls in Greenway Farms. And if I'm not mistaken, it touched also US and Canada, and there were a lot of sites involved. By the way, taking from this, what steps, on your opinion, can the industry take to address these risks? I mean, irrigation water, soil conditions.
If you're a retailer, or a restaurant, or a food manufacturer that's relying on these, leafy greens, these, other items right here, again, I don't see much of an argument against the idea of, why are companies taking the farmers, the growers, word for it in terms of this water testing and treatment? Why aren't major distributors, major companies, major retailers, why are they not sending their own people out to periodically test the water themselves, to do that validation? Again, it's almost as if, here you have a retailer or a supplier, a distributor, and they have a mission statement. And we know this. There's that whole phrase, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Well, guess what? If you're a major retailer or food manufacturer, a distributor, whatever, and you have a mission statement around food safety, and yet you're allowing product to come in and it's unvalidated, it's not adequately tested, there's your weakest link. If you want to make sure that you are living up to what you promise your customers, you got to make sure that all of your partners, all your suppliers, all your distributors, all the participants who work with you are on the same page as you are in terms of the testing, validation, and being able to support the commitment that you're making.
Yeah, I remember, Darren, at the beginning you mentioned the vital role of rapid methods to prevent cross-contamination and the importance of it. What's the other innovations you would prioritize for immediate industry-wide adoption?
Well, there was a lot of conversation, especially around produce and recalls, about digitization of everything from validations to testing results to pretty much anything, right? We need to have, especially with produce, I think, we need to have much more digitization of our paperwork. Rapid testing, I think, is a great way for us to eliminate some of these outbreaks and recalls. I also think that, and again, it's a blanket statement. It may not work with every sector, every commodity, kind of a thing, but too many companies are just a little bit too comfortable with the idea that they can test, they can take a sample and send it off to be testing, but they'll ship their product out right away. And, you know, many times when you hear about a recall, it's about an incident that took place 4, 6, 8 weeks in the past, and much of the product is already consumed. If product was held even for 24 hours, right? Allowing that rapid test results to come back and allowing it to be shipped after that. Yes, imagine how much recalls could be prevented. Is that good for the company? Well, in terms of their trust and their trust in the company and their reputation and their impact on food safety, yes. Will it cost a little bit more? Yes. Will a recall cost even more, or will an outbreak cost even more? Definitely yes, right? But too many times, the product's already consumed, and especially when you're talking about produce or other ready-to-eat foods where there is no additional kill step, this becomes problematic. And I think that again, customers are paying more for food today, and they're expecting that the last thing that they're paying for is food that's going to harm them or their family. I would also recommend that companies, in terms of what they're investing in, is again more testing, more partnerships in terms of again their own testing, their own auditings, their own validations and certifications, doing things of that nature. I think that that would be good for the industry as a whole. I think there's some other things, better training, better equipment, whether it be more adequate gloves. Um, but we've been talking a lot about like pathogens. You know what else has been the root of a lot of recalls, both in Europe and in the U.S.?
Tell us.
Is metal, physical contaminants, a lot of metals and a lot of lead,
Yeah.
far too much. There's also plastic and rubber and other things as well. Glove pieces, making sure you have gloves that don't rip and disintegrate and get into your foods and jam up your equipment. But I was surprised to see when I went through the entire year of recalls for Europe and for the U.S. and North America, how many recalls there were to high lead content and cinnamon or other situations where there were heavy metals in foods. We need to do a little bit better in terms of testing for that. And a lot of that's going to require companies to go back to the source. Not just accept cinnamon as it's cinnamon, put it in there, but really testing that cinnamon or whatever those sources are to make sure we're not getting that into our food. A little surprising how much of a growth or how much of a rise there was in metal debris or lead content in recalls this year.
Actually, it's now a question came in, how does lead get into cinnamon? I'm also very curious how could it happen?
Sometimes it's just due to where we're getting them, the sources. A lot of these are internationally sourced, and unfortunately, there are sources out there who will say it's cheaper for us to put things into the cinnamon, if you will, into the spice that look just like the spice, but are cheaper for us to do it so we get more volume because we're paid by the volume kind of situation. There are obviously completely accidental ways that these happen, but unfortunately, we know that there are some bad actors who will find an economic opportunity through food fraud by way of inserting more lead content into, in this case, cinnamon, because they're being paid by the pound, paid by the weight, if you will. And so we need to have eyes on the ground that are doing testing, independent testing, to make sure that it is 100% whole, cinnamon and nothing else.
Wow. Um, there is one probably last question for today coming. To guarantee safety of full lot, testing one sample won't be enough. Please share your thoughts on it.
Yeah, we need to have if I were if I went back to university as a student and we're doing a scientific study, there would be scientific requirements in terms of what is the adequate number of test results and test samples, kind of a thing. We need to go kind of that direction in terms of you just can't take one sample. Because you ever notice that some of these recalls, it's like because there was a sample that proved negative, and so we have to remove everything that was reproduced from this date to this date, and it's like that's a pretty long date. That's why we have like with boar's head, 7 point something million pounds of something. Right? If we had smaller batches, if we had more samples taken, perhaps economically we could cut down the actual number of pounds of weight or quantity that's being recalled. But I want to flip it to another direction. If we had more adequate testing of more samples and we could limit the size of the amount of recall, think about the environmental impact, right? Not just the idea of how many resources, water, soil, nutrients, carbon footprint, right? To create the food that we assume we're going to eat and now we're throwing it away, but the idea of now we actually have to destroy certain foods that have been recalled, and again, more environmental impact. So I think that more samples, more frequent, more adequate rapid testing and deeper testing could result in lesser quantities being recalled, could result in perhaps not only improving food safety, but even having an environmental impact.
Yeah. And we always have to think about it because, like, what can affect one side, it can also turn out to be on the other way of affection. And Darin, just before we wrap up, maybe you can share like just one message for all industry leaders which we gathered today and the ones who will watch us in recording to take away from today's session. What it would be?
Sure. Uh, quick couple things. One is food safety is non negotiable, should never be anything other than top priority. It's not food unless it's safe food, right? I think that effective rapid testing is something that should be adhered to and advanced more throughout industry. I think we need proactive, intentional, and courageous leaders who are basically there to make sure that we meet the highest standards of food safety, not just meeting the minimum compliance standards. The last thing I'll leave is that companies are and have the ability to shape the future of food safety and establish a legacy of trust through their intentional leadership. If that is the approach that our companies and our leaders take, I expect that we'll see a lot more improvement in terms of how recalls will look, perhaps throughout 2025 and beyond.
Yes, and we are actually here to educate and grow more really conscientious leaders. And that's why actually our academy exists. Thank you very much to all who joined our session today. Thank you, Darin, for accepting my invitation. And all the recording will be available both on LinkedIn and shared to you guys via email. And I'm happy to close up our season of 2024 Academy webinars. Looking forward to see you next year with even more inspiring speeches. And wish you a lovely day, lovely weekends, and see you soon. Bye.